There are moments that decide the fate of kingdoms, and great men who ride into them certain of victory. On a flooded field in northern France, an exhausted English army, starving and riddled with sickness, stood in the mud before the largest host the French nobility had ever assembled. What happened in the next 3 hours would humiliate a kingdom for a generation. What you are about to witness happened. This is British Battlecry. It was the 25th of October, 1415, the feast day of St. Crispin, and the sky over the fields near Agincourt hung low and grey, heavy with days of relentless rain. King Henry V of England stood at the head of an army that should not have existed by that morning. Weeks earlier, his forces had marched out of the captured port of Harfleur, bloated with confidence. Now they were a shadow of that host, 6,000 men reduced by dysentery, hunger, and the brutal march north toward Calais. Their boots rotting, their bodies racked with sickness so severe that some historians would later call the campaign a walking hospital. Arrayed against them, across a narrow strip of freshly ploughed farmland hemmed in by dense woodland on both sides, stood a French army that outnumbered them by a staggering margin, a glittering wall of steel drawn from the very finest bloodlines of French chivalry. Dukes, counts, and the flower of the French nobility had gathered here, certain that this ragged English column, half-starved and far from home, would be swept from the field within the hour. To the French commanders, the outcome was not in question. It was a formality, a final humiliation to be inflicted on an English king who had dared to press his ancestral claim to the throne of France. What the French nobility failed to account for was the ground beneath their own feet. Days of autumn rain had turned the recently tilled field into a swamp of heavy, clinging clay, a detail that meant nothing to men accustomed to thinking of battle in terms of numbers and glory, but which would prove to be the silent executioner of thousands. The French had also failed to account for the men lining the English flanks, nearly 5,000 archers armed with the English longbow, an implement of war that had already terrorized the French at Crécy and Poitiers within living memory of their grandfathers, yet somehow still underestimated by a nobility convinced that the age of the mounted knight rendered peasant bowmen irrelevant. Henry, understanding precisely how narrow his margin for survival was, ordered his archers to drive sharpened wooden stakes into the earth before their positions, angled outward to break any charge, and then he waited. For hours, the two armies stared at one another across the muddy expanse, until finally it was the French who moved first, provoked into advancing by Henry's decision to close the range and unleash the first volleys of arrows into their ranks. What followed was not a battle in the way the French nobility had imagined it. The French vanguard, thousands of mounted knights and men-at-arms in full plate armor, began their advance across ground that had been transformed into a nightmare. Every step sank deeper into the mud, horses stumbling and thrashing, riders struggling under the sheer weight of their own armor as the field sucked at their boots like something alive. And then the English longbowmen began to loose their arrows, not in scattered volleys, but in a continuous, punishing storm. Thousands of arrows a minute, darkening the sky above the advancing French line. The noise alone was described by chroniclers as something that seemed to blot out the sun, a hissing rain of iron falling upon men who had never imagined that common bowmen could inflict such devastation upon the flower of French knighthood. Horses screamed and bolted, throwing their armored riders into the churned mud, where many drowned or suffocated beneath the weight of their own equipment, unable to rise. The narrow field, hemmed in by the woods on either side, meant that the French could not spread out to use their numbers effectively. Instead, rank after rank of advancing men-at-arms collided into the survivors of the volleys ahead of them, creating a crush so severe that soldiers were reportedly crushed to death standing upright. unable even to raise their weapons in the press of bodies. For the French commanders watching from the rear, the scene unfolding before them must have seemed almost impossible to comprehend. This was supposed to be a formality, a swift and decisive crushing of an inferior force, and instead their finest knights were dying in the mud in their thousands, cut down not in glorious cavalry charges, but suffocating beneath the weight of their own countrymen, felled by arrows loosed from men they considered beneath contempt. When the surviving French men-at-arms finally reached the English line, exhausted, sinking to their knees in the clinging earth, they found themselves facing English soldiers who, unburdened by the same weight of armor and fighting on ground they had chosen, met them with axes, swords, and the same longbows now wielded as clubs. Henry himself fought in the thick of the melee, and it was here, according to the chronicles, that a blow to his helmet nearly ended the battle and the war in a single stroke. A piece of his crown reportedly struck away by a French axe. The English line held. What began as a desperate defensive stand became, within hours, an annihilation of the very cream of French aristocracy. An entire generation of noble houses effectively wiped from the field in a single afternoon. By the time the fighting ended, the scale of the French catastrophe was almost impossible for contemporaries to process. Estimates from chroniclers on both sides describe thousands of French dead, among them dukes, counts, and members of the highest nobility in the land, while English losses were remarkably, almost unbelievably light by comparison. The disparity was so severe that it shattered the assumptions an entire continent held about the nature of warfare, the value of heavy cavalry, and the supposed irrelevance of common infantry and archers against armored nobility. For France, Agincourt was not merely a military defeat. It was a wound to the very identity of French chivalry, a public and total humiliation inflicted by an army that had arrived on the field starving, sick, and outnumbered many times over. Word of the disaster spread through the courts of Europe within weeks, and the psychological shock reverberated through French leadership for years, contributing directly to the political chaos that would grip France for the following decade. Henry V returned to England not as a desperate gambler who had barely escaped with his life, but as a king whose victory would be remembered as one of the most stunning reversals of fortune in the history of warfare. A story told and retold for 6 centuries of an exhausted army sinking into the mud that broke the pride of France in a single brutal afternoon.